Lester, Wushu Engineer. I'm going to spoil this video right away by giving you my honest answer to the question posed in the thumbnail. And then for those who are interested in the details of the discussion, you can listen to the rest of my video. So, spoiler alert. Yes, if you are a serious combat-based martial artist, you absolutely need to be actively engaged in serious physical conditioning training. The idea that if you are training for active combat, that you should be focusing a lot of energy and attention on physical condition should be a no-brainer. It should be blatantly obvious. And yet it appears in these days that some of the conversations that we've had with people and the data that we've gleaned from some of our research seems to indicate that this concept is no longer obvious enough for some people. So I decided to make this video and hopefully dispel some of the myths. Physical training for combat has been practiced for many thousands of years, perhaps even for most of human history, at least in some form or other. We see that even some predatory animals, like lions for instance, play fight with each other when they're young to hone their skills, which can be seen as a form of physical training. Now, if other animals do this instinctively, we more than likely did engage in physical training for hunting and combat in prehistory. Codified martial arts practice is very, very old and tied closely with military training. However, our more modern idea of martial arts practice for civilian self-defense is likely a lot more recent, probably heavily influenced by the establishment of cities and other large communities of individuals over the last few thousand years. Nonetheless, both military and civilian martial arts still closely follow each other in terms of development and have been heavily influenced and informed by each other. So observations made on military training can equally be applied to civilian self-defense training, at least in some regard. There are written references to training soldiers for combat that can be traced back to the time of the late Roman Empire. It could also be argued that the ancient Olympic Games, which are widely accepted to have begun in 776 BC, while certainly a religious and athletic festival, also showcased many of the skills and traits that were desirable for soldiers and other combatants, implying that combat training for these skills was an established concept back then. It's likely that the concept of physical training for combat is actually far, far older than this. Although I couldn't find any direct historic references to physical training for combat related to ancient Egypt, some of the bows and other weapon combinations that were used in warfare at the time required significant skill and strength to use effectively. This would heavily imply that soldiers engaged in specific physical conditioning and training. Let me know in the comments below if you've seen any direct historic references to physical training and other types of combat training in early human history. I'd be interested. Bringing it back to the present day, I am not aware of any single military in the world that does not put its soldiers through rigorous physical conditioning to prepare them to fight. Training soldiers costs money and resources. And one thing's for sure, militaries like saving money when they can, sometimes even to the detriment of the common soldier. However, in the case of physical conditioning for soldiers, militaries around the world have deemed it so critical for their success that it has never been in danger of being rationalized away. The military would not waste time, money, and resources on physical training for soldiers if it was not strictly necessary. That's all very well and good, but are there any scientific studies that indicate that physical conditioning training improves combat performance? Well, the idea that physical conditioning training improves combat performance is generally accepted within the sports science community as fact. Due to the thousands of years of direct physical evidence attesting to the correlation accumulated from a multitude of eras and geographically diverse battlefields. However, there are also many scientific papers that either indirectly or directly address this question. I have selected a few of them to display here. Here are three of those papers. Uthoff in 2022 looks at the effects of various types of physical training on striking performance. Ridzik in 2021 looks at the correlation between fitness from a range of fitness and strength tests and analysis of fighting performance during a fight. And James in 2016 is a review of a number of studies in which physical fitness and strength characteristics were compared with competition rankings or levels of competitor. All these papers either show or imply that there is a correlation between physical fitness and combat performance. Finally, we have the following paper from friend of the channel, Dr. Luke Delvigio. In the study, it was shown that the addition of a strength and power training program to combat training may have a beneficial effect on cross-punch impact power and 5-rep max half squat strength in amateur male combat athletes. Note that these studies only represent a small percentage of the studies that have been done that could be used to show a correlation between physical condition and combat performance. And yet, despite the weight of scientific evidence and the thousands of years of experiential and anecdotal data which are in support of the correlation between physical condition and combat performance, within martial arts circles, there appears to be this persistent idea that you can be a serious, competent martial art combatant without doing any regular, consistent, and intense physical conditioning training. We've seen the effect of this attitude in the test results for some of the people that we have tested over the years at Martel. The number of scientific studies we've performed that have involved both actively training martial artists and non-martial artists alike has increased rapidly over the last 5 years as Martel has become more active in the research sphere. In addition, the number of practicing martial artists that we have performed a key performance indicator testing for has also slowly increased. And what we've found is that a disturbingly high percentage of martial artists we have tested showed poor physical condition, including lack of peripheral and core muscular strength, as well as poor fitness, despite the fact that they reported active and consistent martial arts practice, sometimes over the course of several decades. The idea that you can be a serious combat-based martial artist and yet not engage in regular progressive overload physical training is demonstrably flawed. And yet I've encountered it so often that I decided to make this video. Firstly, let's be clear in terms of what I mean by a serious combat-based martial artist. Well, basically I mean serious as in someone who is seeking every advantage that they can possibly get to maximize their chances of winning in a fight, and combat-based as in someone whose primary focus, or at least one of the primary focuses, is on applying their martial arts practice to fighting, either in competition or in self-defense. In other words, to further expand on that, if someone is serious about being the best martial arts-based fighter that they can possibly be, they will do as much training as they can possibly sustain with their lifestyle. If being stronger, faster, fitter, tougher, etc. improves their chances of success in combat, they will train to be as physically capable as possible, despite the discomfort and pain associated with serious physical training. They would not simply concentrate on one aspect of training, like technique practice, for instance, or sparring, as important as those may be, while neglecting any of the other important practices of martial arts training, because doing so would just reduce their chances of success. Now, I need to insert an important caveat here. People practice martial arts for many different reasons, such as health reasons, for entertainment, for the social aspect of training in a group, for cultural reasons, or other reasons not directly related to fighting. A good example of a martial art that often attracts people who train for reasons other than fighting is Tai Chi. A large percentage of Tai Chi practitioners are older people who practice purely for health, mobility, and physical and mental well-being. However, they would typically not be able to apply their Tai Chi effectively in serious combat because they neglect intense physical training, sparring practice, and other important pillars of martial arts training. Even historically, there are accounts of Tai Chi practitioners having drawn a certain level of criticism when they have neglected physical conditioning and actual combat application and sparring, intense sparring, as part of their regime, because this has led them to underperforming when challenged in fight. This situation has persisted into the modern age, with many Tai Chi and also Kung Fu practitioners who either falsely or naively claim combat proficiency, being badly beaten by superior fighters who do not neglect physical conditioning or intense sparring practice. We teach Tai Chi as part of our core content and curriculum as well. However, in our particular case, we insist that the Tai Chi students also train in Kung Fu, which includes the rigorous physical training, sparring, and combat technique practice that is necessary for someone who wants to understand how to apply Tai Chi in actual fighting. Now, despite all this, I'm not targeting or criticizing people in this video who consciously practice a martial art for reasons other than learning how to fight as effectively as possible. There's nothing inherently wrong with that at all, and it does not mean that they cannot call themselves martial artists at all. I'm not saying that if you do not train seriously for combat that you can't call yourself a martial artist. However, people who do train martial arts recreationally should not have irrational expectations of themselves and certainly should not egotistically believe or claim that they are somehow serious fighters. There should be a strong caveat inserted whenever someone like this introduces themselves as a martial artist, because of preconceived and established popular perceptions of what the term martial artist means. When you identify yourself as a martial artist, most people immediately assume that you mean that you are a trained fighter. In other words, a serious combat-based martial artist. And I do think that at least a significant percentage of people like to imply this level of competency on their own part because it inflates their egos. And as any true serious martial artist knows, egos are dangerous things that at best make you behave stupidly and at worst can get you severely injured or killed. Not focusing on combat does not exclude someone from calling themselves a martial artist. However, if they're honest with themselves, it should exclude them from implying that they are a serious combat-based martial artist. Recreational martial artists should cultivate a very healthy dose of skepticism when it comes to their own fighting abilities. Of course, even serious martial artists should do this as well, remembering that the ego can make fools of us all. Actual combat should never be entered into lightly or with a sense of bravado. Master Chen, the head of our system of Chang Hong, wrote in his book Key to Hong Chuan that when practicing Hong Fist, potency or fitness training is one aspect that cannot be underestimated. As the proverb says, training without potency training will result in all emptiness. He follows that up later with, should one learn martial arts for recreational purposes, it would not be necessary to apply the rules of the fist form nor potency training. However, as a serious martial artist, it is necessary to apply the rules of connecting qi, body, and soul so that they complement one another. Clearly, Master Chen understood the importance of physical conditioning training for what he terms a serious martial artist. So perhaps a good way for people who fall into this recreational martial artist category to describe their martial arts practice both internally to themselves and externally to others who inquire, is as a recreational martial artist or casual martial artist. But where does the myth of physical exercise-free and yet still serious martial artistry come from? I thought that I'd do my best to understand where this myth stems from and analyze its value. And I believe that at its core, underlying the main supporting arguments, is a combination of simple laziness and ignorance. Of course, for those who have pre-existing medical conditions that prevent them from training hard, laziness is not the issue. Hard physical training, though, is by its very definition a lot of hard work. And it's simply a lot easier for some folk who do not have pre-existing medical conditions that prevent them from training to make believe that they are badasses without putting in the hard work that they need to do in order to truly get stronger, faster, fitter, improve, and asymptotically approach their maximum badassery potential. I'll refer you to the graph on the screen now. However, an honest acknowledgement of laziness would not do for some, because that requires personal accountability and taking responsibility for their own human weaknesses, which could potentially then lead to hard work in order to buck that trend. Before I go on from this point, I want to address the "I got no time" myth. Many people claim that they would like to practice martial arts seriously, but that they just don't have the time to commit to it. Perhaps. In a few very rare exceptions, when you ask for people to describe their day-to-day activities, and assuming that they are truthful and not embellishing their accounts, it really does sound like they have intentionally teleported themselves onto a penal world in the Warhammer 40k universe. However, in most cases, the typical "I got no time" person does a lot of things that they miraculously do find the time and resources to do instead of training. Things like binge watching TV series, for instance, being glued to social media for hours, or playing computer games. You do know that you can be training instead of tweeting, right? I think the "I got no time" excuse is exactly that in most cases. It's an excuse, a cop-out. People will always find or make time to do something that they really want to do. It's as simple as that. I mentioned earlier that I believe that the major underpinnings of the lack of physical training in some martial artists who would like to be serious fighters is a combination of laziness and ignorance. Well, why ignorance? And ignorance of what exactly? Well, I'd say ignorance of exactly how hard fighting for real really is. Some martial artists have never had to face the odds in a fight and have never gotten hit, literally and figuratively, with how serious situations can become and how difficult it is to fight under extreme pressure. Those that have been exposed to this realize that they need every advantage they can leverage in their training to maximize their chances of success. They are under no illusions about how difficult fighting is and or how difficult it can be, and thus they do not shirk the blood, sweat and tears of hard physical training. You could say that through personal experience they have been made aware of the relevance of extreme levels of preparation. But as a result of ignorance and laziness, instead of knuckling down and training hard, what some people prefer to do is to perform complex mental gymnastics to come up with a set of supporting arguments for their inherent laziness towards physical training. I've refined what I believe to be the three main supporting arguments for this compromised attitude towards martial arts training. And they are: technique is all you need, chi or ki will fight my battles for me, and just spar, bro. The concept of technique over physical brute force is fundamental to most martial arts and is built on a sound foundation. It's actually profoundly fundamental to the philosophical concept of the balance between yin and yang in traditional Kung Fu. In fact, it's so much a part of the core of Kung Fu that it leads to proverbs such as "do not resist hard with hard" and "do not collide with your opponent." Under that, or like that. A brute force approach to combat works only as long as one's opponent is physically and technically inferior. It fails spectacularly when they are not. This is why a balanced approach of hard and soft is baked into the DNA of traditional Kung Fu. Using this approach, it is indeed possible, although not easy, so I make no bones about that, to defeat an opponent who is physically superior through the application of superior skill, cunning, softness, and technique. However, in the case of the ignorant, lazy martial artist, the concept is taken out of context to support a lazy attitude towards training. Technique is very important, but it is built on more than just technique practice. It's built on learned biomechanical principles that improve the efficiency of force utilization, on combat experience, and also on baseline physical capabilities. It is amazing how much better techniques work when you are fast, fit, agile, strong, and tough. The concept of technique winning over brute force assumes that you are physically outclassed by your opponent, but not as a result of your own lazy lack of training. Instead, it's as a result of natural genetic advantage on your opponent's part that you could do nothing about. If you're weaker than your opponent simply because you sat around watching Netflix series and eating crisps while you should have been training, your likely defeat is all on you, not on your technique. Now, some martial arts, like my own system, focus on what we call internal training and the generation and control of what is referred to traditionally as chi or ki. Internal training is a type of training involving elevated states of awareness of the external environment and the practitioner's internal brain and body functions. Over time, this awareness leads to heightened levels of conscious control of the mind, of autonomous body functions, and of how forces are generated and directed through the body. This internal skill set can allow a practitioner to generate superior levels of force, operate with much higher precision, react far faster, be tougher, make very rapid tactical decisions, and be far more mechanically efficient, amongst many other benefits. Amongst some inexperienced internal practitioners, there is a sense of almost disdain towards hard physical training. This can sometimes lead to the erroneous notion that physical training is not necessary if one is practicing internal training. On the contrary, if one is a serious internal martial artist and knows what one is doing, the physical training is actually a very important part of exercising and training the internal skill set. They're not separate. It's a bit like a test bed or platform that you can use to hone your internal training under pressure. So no, as an internal martial artist, I do not resent the push-ups. And finally, we have the just spar bro argument. While I agree that sparring is very important, it can never allow a martial artist to grow into their full potential. Now, what do I mean by that? If you were to imagine a school or a system where there is no established technique, no established curriculum, and no senior instructors at all, but just a bunch of people thrown together, very much like a fight club. Throwing people into this proverbial pit and getting them to duke it out until they get good is a very flawed approach. Firstly, there are advantages to this approach. However, it can also lead to injury, trauma, cringe responses, and unnecessary tension. People can only stomach that kind of thing for so long. Secondly, with no injection of skill or knowledge from the outside, the skill level of that group will be dictated and limited by the skills of those who participate. The skill level of the group will rise rapidly, but will eventually start to stagnate and plateau when everyone knows everyone else well enough. That's why most systems, even most modern systems, include other forms of training, like for instance technique training and katas or the like. This injects knowledge from the outside into the group and can help to elevate their skill level beyond what the group would be able to accomplish all on their own, just using sparring alone. Does physical training impact on your sparring? Well, as I've already mentioned, physical training heavily underpins how good your sparring actually is. In fact, this scientific study actually shows just that. While you can benefit in terms of physical condition due to sparring on its own it can never match the improvements that a proper physical training program can bring to a martial artist. Now, before anyone takes what I've said here to absurd extremes and imply that I believe that physical conditioning is somehow all you need for success, or that it's more important than fighting technique, sparring practice, and internal training, that is not what I have stated. I have simply stated that it is absolutely necessary for someone who considers themselves to be a serious combat-based martial artist to also include serious physical conditioning training as part of their training regime. The disadvantage of not doing so is so extreme that no serious martial artist would leave out that aspect of training, as evidenced by the numerous studies that have been performed that support this, and the fact that most older and many newer martial arts include rigorous physical training as part of their normal curriculum. Neglecting physical training would be like consciously and deliberately giving yourself a handicap for no other reason than the fact that you dislike the discomfort associated with hard work. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're interested, or if you want to discuss things further, or if you have a point to make, leave it in the comments below, and I'll see you all again next time. Cheers.